All right, welcome back, everybody. Finishing off lesson three today, hopefully in just a one-part video. Yesterday we started, we talked about the different social classes in the South, and today we are going to talk about the slavery system in the South. So, the life of enslaved African Americans would be determined by strict laws and the practices of individual slave owners. Conditions will vary from plantation to plantation as every slave owner was a little bit different from the next. And some owners made sure their enslaved workers had very clean cabins, decent food, and warm clothes, and they were well taken care of. But on the other side, planters sometimes spent as little as possible on their enslaved workers, meaning they had very poor clothing, very poor food, and very dirty conditions to live in. Now, slave codes, they will be established in the southern states to basically keep enslaved African Americans from either running away or rebelling against them. So the slave codes will have many different parts to them. First, under the codes, enslaved African Americans were forbidden to gather in groups of more than three. They could not leave their owner's land without a written pass from their owner and were not allowed to own guns. Slave codes also made it a crime for enslaved African Americans to learn how to read and write. And there will be a very specific reason why they didn't want them to be able to read and write. First off, owners hoped that this law would make it hard for them to escape slavery. Now, the whole thought behind that is if they escape, well, they can't read any signs to get them north, and as well as they're more concerned with them being able to read train schedules because if they can read a train schedule, it's a very quick way to get north. And so some laws were also meant to protect enslaved African Americans not only from the worst forms of abuse, but um, they're going to look to not only protect them and limit their rights, but they want to protect African American slaves. However, enslaved African Americans did not have the right to testify in court, and as a result, they were not able to bring charges against owners who abused them. So, if they're being abused, they still can't do anything about it because they're not able to actually do anything in court. Also, enslaved African Americans had only one real protection against mistreatment, and that one protection is owners looked at their enslaved workers as very valuable property. And so, because they're viewed as very valuable property, they will be spared a lot of punishment. However, most slave owners wanted to keep this human property healthy and productive because they do spend a lot of money on their enslaved workers. But they also would not hesitate to punish enslaved African Americans in order to keep them in line. Punishments would be anything from being whipped to bones being broken. However, they tried to keep the physical punishment as little as possible, mainly in order to protect their property and their investment. So, even the kindest owners insisted that their slaves work very long and hard days. Enslaved African Americans would work from dawn to dusk, which could be up to 16 hours a day. And so that's the kind of work life they faced. They would be using hand tools, things like that. Rarely were they ever given machinery. And their family life could be a little complicated and complex for them. It will be very hard for enslaved African Americans to keep their families together. Southern laws did not recognize slave marriage or slave families, which would make it very difficult for them to stay together. And as a result, owners could sell a husband and a wife to different buyers. Children were often taken from their parents and sold as well. So it's very difficult for these slave families to stay together because they were so easily split up and sent to other places. On large plantations, also many enslaved families did manage to stay together. So the larger plantation you're on, the easier it would be for you to stay together. If you're on a smaller plantation, it would be a lot easier for you to be sold off. For those African Americans on these large plantations, this family idea, sorry, would be a source of strength and pride, as well as love for one another. Grandparents, children, aunts, uncles, and cousins will all form a close knit group, and all these people would rely on each other to help each other out and make sure their best interests are being taken care of. And this idea of an extended family will have its roots all the way back to Africa. So, an extended family is beyond just your parents and brother or sister, it includes your aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents. So, enslaved African Americans will also preserve their traditions as well. And parents would teach traditions, songs, stories, history, and morals all to their children in order to keep what little heritage they have left alive. And by the 1800s, many enslaved African Americans will be devout Christians, and that will be because planters often allowed white ministers to preach to their slaves. So ministers will come to plantations and preach and hold mass for the slaves. And because of this, a lot of African Americans will lose their original religion that they had when they were brought here from Africa, and that would be replaced by Christianity. African Americans also had their own preachers and set of beliefs. So, yes, they were Christians, but they had a little different view on how things were. Religion also helped African Americans cope with the harshment of slave life. And that would be because Bible stories about the ancient Israelites had escaped from slavery to freedom and inspired a new type of religious song called a spiritual. So, because of these stories of the Israelites escaping Egypt to go to the promised land and getting their freedom, they're going to inspire a new kind of song that the African Americans will sing called spirituals. Yet, enslaved African Americans had to be cautious even in their religious practice. And they're going to have to be very careful because while they sang of freedom and spirituals, the words of the spirituals suggested that this freedom would come after death so as not to alarm slave owners. Basically, they wanted freedom, they would sing about freedom, but they had to make sure that it didn't seem like they were trying to escape or start an uprising. And so, how did enslaved African Americans resist their enslavement? So, here and there, enslaved African Americans will strike back against the system that denied them both freedom and wages. So, African Americans will attack the institution of slavery. And some will slow the pace of their work, break tools, destroy crops, or pretend they were ill so that they didn't have to work. By doing all these things, you're going to slow down crop production, which means the owners won't make as much money. Some will passively resist by learning to read and write, and others would take bolder actions. So, just the fact that they were learning to read and write, some viewed that as enough resistance against slavery. So, those that are going to take it a little further, they're going to try to escape north because they felt like once they got to the north, they would be free. And because this journey was long and dangerous, very few would actually make it to freedom in the north. And every county had slave patrols and sheriff's officers that were ready to question any unknown black person. And that's what made this so difficult is if they were seen without those papers giving them permission to leave the plantation, then well, they would be arrested and sent back to their owner. And because Southern laws offered no means to resist slavery, a few African Americans will eventually turn to violence. We're going to talk about those instances now. So the first would be Gabriel Prosser, who was an enslaved African American and organized an uprising in Richmond, Virginia, but ended up ultimately failing in his uprising. And Denmark Vesey was a free African American who planned a revolt to take place in 1822. However, before his revolt even began, Vesey would be given up and betrayed by another conspirator. So those two would end very, very quickly. Both Prosser and Vesey will be executed along with dozens of their followers. So the reasons why they're executed and their followers are as well is the whites in the South are trying to send a message to other slaves of this is what will happen to you if you try to rise up and go against us. Other armed slave revolts will also take a toll on both blacks and whites. So it's not just African Americans that are going to be killed in these slave revolts, but whites will also suffer as well. The Stonewall Rebellion in South Carolina in 1739 would result in the deaths of 30 enslaved African American rebels and a similar number of white colonists at the time. So this rebellion not only killed 30 enslaved African Americans, but also killed about 30 white colonists. However, probably the most famous slave uprising would be that of Nat Turner, and he's going to lead a major revolt starting in 1831. An enslaved worker on a plantation in Southampton County, Virginia, Turner believed his mission was to take revenge on plantation owners. So Turner didn't like where he was, didn't like what was going on. So in 1831, he's going to seek out to enact his revenge on different plantation owners throughout Virginia. Turner will lead his followers through Virginia, killing more than 57 whites. And for nearly 2 months, terrified whites hunted the countryside looking for Turner and his followers. So while they were hunting the countryside for him, they killed many innocent African Americans before catching and hanging Nat Turner. Now, Nat Turner will also change a lot of things as well. So, his revolt will increase Southern fears of an uprising of enslaved African Americans. Whites now became even more suspicious of African Americans, both free and enslaved, so they're going to keep a tougher eye on these people. Southern states also reacted to the revolt by further limiting African American rights. So not only are they going to be more suspicious of an uprising, but now they're going to start limiting their rights even more. At first, though, Virginia and the Virginia legislature debated ending slavery in the state. However, in the end, they will ultimately decide against it, mainly because those people in power are the rich plantation owners that actually have slaves. So yeah, Virginia did think about ending slavery. However, in the end, they decided against it. Virginia then, like other southern states, will increase its restrictions on African Americans. So instead of ending slavery, they're actually just going to add restrictions to African Americans. Overall, though, organized slave revolts would be very rare, and they didn't take place as often as people might think. And that's mainly going to be because Southern whites were very well armed and kept careful track of African Americans. And an uprising by the African Americans had almost no chance of success because they weren't allowed to own any guns. They had nothing to fight with. So anything they had to get to fight with, they had to steal from the whites and overpower them, which would be very, very difficult to do. So that is the end of lesson 3. Tomorrow, your assignment is to make sure you read over lesson 4, which starts on page 443 and continues all the way through 449. So, kind of a shorter section. And so, you are going to be reading and do your own 2-column note for that. And when you are done, that is all your homework is for Monday. So that, once again, is Monday's homework. I will add that to the description of the video so that way you have it. And make sure you check my webpage to double check and make sure you're doing all the assignments. Um, at this point, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I will talk to you guys again with another lesson on Tuesday. So have a good weekend and enjoy your time off in the meantime.